Let me tell you about a woman the whole town laughed at. On a cold, bright morning in the fall of 1962, inside a stock auction barn on the edge of Magdalena, New Mexico. If you have never stood in that country, picture a high, dry town strung along one main street, with the Magdalena Mountains rising blue behind it, and the wide brown plains running west toward Datil, and the plains of San Agustin, where the grass thins out and the peñon and one-seed juniper go on for miles. It is beautiful country, but it is hard country, and everybody in that barn that morning knew the difference between the two. The barn smelled of hay and diesel and cold coffee. Ranchers stood along the pipe railings in canvas coats and sweat-stained hats, stamping their boots against the chill, and the auctioneer, a heavy, cheerful man named Cleo Barfoot, ran his voice up and down the rows like a man playing a fiddle. They were selling off the last pieces of a foreclosed outfit that day. Cattle went first, then a good used windmill, then a wagon and some tack. The bidding was quick and loud, the way a crowd gets when it is enjoying itself, and the men laughed and nudged each other between lots. Now, near the back, on a bench by the tall barn doors, sat a woman almost nobody was looking at. Her name was Ruth Ellender, and she was 57 years old that fall. She sat very straight in a man's canvas work coat that was too big for her at the shoulders, the coat that had belonged to her husband, Marlin, who had been dead 11 months. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She did not talk to anybody, and nobody much talked to her. Here is what you need to understand about how that town saw Ruth Ellender. They saw a quiet widow who had lost her man and would not last. Marlin had been a windmiller and a small sheepman, a lean, patient fellow who could raise water out of dry ground and coax a flock through a bad winter. And when a heart attack took him out by the corral one November evening, folks nodded and said it was a shame. And then they quietly decided that Ruth would sell out and move in with a sister somewhere, and that would be the end of the Ellenders. She was too old, they figured, too poor, and far too quiet to hold ground of her own. Grief had made her seem even smaller. She had spent the winter selling off Marlin's tools and his good use just to keep the lamp lit, and everybody knew it. What they did not know was that Ruth Ellender had been listening to that land for 30 years. She had ridden it beside Marlin. She had sat at the kitchen table while old Ignacio Sedillo, the neighbor to Draws Over, drew maps and spilled sugar and told her husband where the water really lived under that country, and how a man could bring dead ground back if he had the patience of a stone. Ruth had poured the coffee and said nothing and remembered every word. But nobody in that barn had ever thought to ask a quiet woman what she knew. The last lot of the day was the one no one wanted. Cleo Barfoot read it off his clipboard, almost apologizing. 600 acres out toward Datil, he said. The old Pruett place. Deeded ground with a caved-in dugout and a dead windmill, and no live water on it anywhere. The men along the rail chuckled before he even asked for a bid. They knew that ground. It had been grazed to the dirt for 40 years, cut through with raw arroyos where every rain tore the soil away, and gone to bare caliche and cholla, and blowing dust. Play out, they called it. Worthless. Warren Tice, the biggest cattleman in that end of the county, a broad, prosperous man with a silver hatband, leaned on the rail and said loud enough for the whole barn to hear that he would not take that section as a gift, because you would spend more mending fence than the grass would ever pay back. Cleo Barfoot asked for a bid anyway, out of habit, and started low. $50, he said. Anybody. The barn was quiet. Then somebody laughed, and Cleo lowered his voice like a man about to pass the lot over and go home. And that is when the widow stood up. She stood up slow, in Marlin's big coat, and she said, in a plain, steady voice that carried farther than she meant it to, $310. You could have heard a horsefly cross that barn. Every head turned to the back bench. $310 was not a fortune, but everybody who knew Ruth Ellender knew exactly what it was. It was every last cent she had in the world. It was the money from Marlin's ewes and Marlin's tools, the winter money, the moving to her sister money, the whole of what she owned laid down on 600 acres of dust that a rich man had just refused for free. Cleo Barfoot blinked at her. He asked gentle if she was sure. Ruth said she was sure. And then the barn laughed. Not cruel exactly, but loose and easy and certain. The way a crowd laughs at something it has already decided is foolish. Warren Tice shook his head and grinned and said, "Well, boys, the Pruett place finally found a buyer, and it took a widow woman who don't know dust from grass." The men around him laughed harder. Cleo, because there was no other bid and never would be, brought his hand down. "Sold," he said, "to Mrs. Ellender, $310. And it came out of him almost like a question. Ruth walked up the sawdust aisle through all that laughing to the clerk's table, and she counted the money out in worn bills and coins onto the wood, slow, every last dollar of it. While the men watched and smiled, she signed the paper. She folded her copy into the breast pocket of Marlin's coat, over her heart, and she buttoned the flap down over it. Then she walked out the tall barn doors into the cold, bright light, and the laughing followed her all the way to her truck. But here's the thing those men could not see, standing there so pleased with themselves. Ruth Ellender had not bought 600 acres of dust. She had bought a piece of ground she had crossed 100 times beside her husband, and she knew something about it that not one laughing man in that barn knew. She knew where the water was, and that is not what this story is really about either. But it is where the whole of it begins. Land like the Pruett place sold cheap all through the arid Southwest for a plain reason. Decades of running too many cattle on thin, slow-growing range stripped the native grama grass. And once the sod was gone, the rain no longer soaked in. Instead, it ran off fast, cutting deep arroyos and carrying the topsoil away, so the ground grew drier and barer each year. Buyers saw only the bare surface and the deep cuts, and judged it dead. What most of them did not know was that such land is not gone. It is wounded, and wounds, given the right care, can close. Now here is what you need to understand about the weeks that followed, because this is the part the town never saw, and it is the part that mattered. 2 days after the auction, Ruth Ellender loaded a wagon. She had a borrowed mule named Pete, a roll of canvas, a shovel and a grubbing hoe and a pick, a sack of pinto beans, a little flour and coffee, and 11 Navajo churro sheep. The old four-horned desert breed her husband had always kept, because they could live on browse that would starve a finer animal. That was the whole of her outfit. She drove out the long dirt road toward Detil, past Warren Tice's fat cattle and green windmill tanks, and onto her own 600 acres of bare ground. And she did not come back to town for a month. The Pruett place was as bad as everyone said. The old dugout had caved in, so Ruth patched it with canvas and cedar poles and lived in it like a badger. The windmill was a skeleton of rusted iron with the sucker rod snapped off down the well. The land itself was the worst of it. Where there had once been grass, there was now bare, cracked caliche, pale as bone, studded with cholla and stunted juniper. And everywhere the arroyos, the raw cuts where 40 years of rain had torn the soil out and hauled it off toward the Rio Grande. Some of them deep enough to swallow a standing man. To a cattleman like Warren Tice, it was a graveyard. To Ruth, it was a patient, and she had learned her doctoring at a kitchen table long ago. Because here is the hidden knowledge she carried, the thing the barn had laughed at without ever knowing it was there. Old Ignacio Sedillo, whose people had run sheep on that plain since before it was anybody's county, had taught Marlin 2 things. And Marlin had taught Ruth. The first was how to read the land for water, how to see in the lay of a slope and the color of a plant, and the slant of the ground where the water still moved underneath, hidden, waiting. The second was that you do not fight dry land with force. You slow the water down and you give the ground rest. And you do these small things over and over for years, and the land heals itself. Ignacio had a word for the little rock structures his grandfather built across the washes. Trincheras, he called them. Ruth remembered. So she began, and she began small. On the 3rd morning, she walked the whole spread, slow, watching. Below a low bench under a big one-seed juniper greener than anything around it, she found what she was looking for. A seep, a place where the ground stayed dark and damp, where a spring had once run before the eroding hillside buried it under silt and gravel. The town would have walked right past it. Ruth knelt down and put her hand flat on the cool, damp earth, and let me tell you, she stayed like that a long while, because it was the first time since Marlin died that she had felt sure of anything. Then she picked up her shovel and went to work. Day after day, she dug the choked silt out of that seep, one careful load at a time, so as not to break whatever channel fed it. It was slow, aching labor for a woman of 57, alone, and for a long time nothing came of it but mud. But she kept at it, because Ignacio had told Marlin that the patient man drinks, and the hasty man eats dust, and Ruth had the patience of a stone. While the seep did its slow work, she started on the arroyos. This is the part I want you to picture. because it is the heart of what she knew. Ruth did not try to fill those great cuts. She gathered rock, the loose flat stones that lay all over that country, and she built them into low dams across the bottom of the washes, no higher than her knee. One-rock dams, some folks call them. A single course of stone laid careful across the flow. She built dozens of them, then hundreds, working from the top of each draw downward, her hands going raw inside Marlin's old gloves. A knee-high line of rock does not look like much. A rich man riding by would laugh at it, and one did. But every one of those little dams was built to do a simple, powerful thing. When the rain came, it would slow the racing water just enough to let it drop its load of silt and let some of it soak into the ground instead of tearing off downhill. And she rested the range. This was the hardest thing for the neighbors to understand, and the thing they mocked most. Ruth ran only her 11 sheep on 600 acres, and she moved them careful and never let them bite the recovering ground too low. Warren Tice, when he heard of it, laughed out loud at the feed store. 600 acres and 11 head of scrub sheep, he said, and the woman thinks she is ranching. He said she would starve before the grass ever came, if it ever came, which it would not. He was not entirely wrong about the hardship. That winter was long and thin. Ruth's flour ran low, and her coffee ran out. She ate beans and juniper-smoked mutton, and melted snow for water when the seep froze. There were nights in that canvas dugout, with the wind coming off the plains of San Agustin like a train, when she sat with Marlin's coat wrapped around her, and her husband's dented tin cup warming her hands, and wondered, in the plain, honest way of a grieving person, whether the whole town was right, and she was only a foolish old woman freezing to death on a grave. She never said so to a living soul, but she thought it. Then one gray afternoon in the spring, she walked down to the seep, and where there had been only damp mud, there was now a thin, bright thread of water, no wider than her finger, running clear over the gravel and pooling in the little basin she had dug. Ruth Ellender knelt down and filled Marlin's tin cup and drank, and the water was cold and sweet and alive. She did not shout. There was no one to shout to. She just knelt there in the dust with the cup in her two hands, and she said, quiet, to a man 11 months in the ground, "There it is, Marlin. Right where you said." But a finger of water and 1,000 little rock dams still had to be tested. All that patient work through all that hard winter came down to one question that only the sky could answer. Come July, the monsoon rains would sweep in off the mountains, hard and sudden the way they do in that country. And they would either fill her healed ground and prove her right, or they would rip her little dams out by the roots and wash away everything she had built and every dollar she had left, and give the whole town one last good laugh at the widow woman. And July was coming. The little rock structures Ruth built have a long history in the dry Southwest. One-rock dams, and the older trincheras, low stone lines laid across eroding washes, do not try to stop water. They slow it. Slowed water drops the silt it carries and soaks in, rather than cutting deeper. Over several seasons, the silt builds behind each dam into a moist bench where native grass takes hold, healing the arroyo from the bottom up. Ranchers and landmenders across New Mexico and Arizona still use this patient, low-cost method to bring gullied land back to life. The monsoon came the second week of July, and it came the way it always comes to that high plain, all at once. For weeks, the sky had been building white towers over the Magdalena Mountains every afternoon. And then one evening, the towers went black and low, and the first cold wind came racing ahead of them across the flats, and the rain fell out of the sky in ropes. Thunder rolled off the Dattel Rim. Lightning walked the ridgelines. And on 600 acres of what everyone called dead ground, an old woman stood in the door of her dugout in her dead husband's coat and watched the water come down. Now this is the moment everything turned on, so let me slow it down for you. On the overgrazed ranches all around her, that same hard rain was a thief. It hit the bare-packed ground and could not soak in, so it sheeted off fast and gathered into the arroyos and went tearing away downhill, brown and violent, carrying another year's worth of precious soil off toward the river and cutting the cuts a little deeper. That is what 40 years of ruin looks like in a hard rain. That is what Warren Tice's back sections did that very night. But on Ruth Ellender's ground, the water met 1,000 knee-high walls of rock. It slowed, it spread out, and pooled behind each little dam. It dropped the silt it was carrying, laying down a thin skin of new soil behind every course of stone, and it sank, quiet, into the thirsty ground instead of racing away. Ruth walked her draws the next morning in the wet gray light, her boots sucking in mud she had not seen in that country in years. And she found her dams standing, every one, each with a fresh little bench of dark wet silt caught behind it, and a shallow pool soaking slowly down. The seep below the juniper was running strong as a garden hose, and the earthen tank she had dug by hand through the cold months, the one the neighbors never even knew about, sat brimful of clean water reflecting the broken clouds. Here is what you need to understand. Ruth did not get lucky. She had built her land to do exactly that, and it had done exactly that, because she understood a thing the whole county had forgotten. The rain that ruined the others was the same rain that saved her. The only difference was the ground it fell on. The grass came next, and the grass is what silenced them. Where the silt had caught and the water had soaked in, the old native seed that had lain sleeping in that soil for 40 years woke up. Blue grama and Saukton greened the swales first, then spread up the gentle slopes. Chamisa, the tough gray rabbit brush of that country, threw up new growth and bloomed gold along the healed washes. By the end of that first summer, Ruth Ellender's 600 worthless acres had more standing feet on them than they had carried in a generation. And her 11 Navajo churro sheep had become 19, fat and slick, with 2 sets of twins among the ewes. The neighbors did not believe it at first. Word drifted into Magdalena slow, the way it does. A freighter who passed her fence line. A boy hunting rabbits who came home and told his father the Pruett place was green. Folks said it must be a wet corner, a fluke, that it would burn off by August. But it did not burn off. It held. And then the county got its answer to the question of whether Ruth Ellender knew dust from grass. And the answer came, the way these things do, in the shape of a drought. The year that followed was one of the driest anybody in that end of New Mexico could remember. The monsoon failed. The winter snows never came. By the next summer, the range across the whole plain was blowing away, and the big outfits that had run cattle hard on thin grass for decades were caught with nothing. Warren Tice's fat, white-faced cattle went gaunt and hollow. His dirt tanks cracked and dried to curled plates of mud. He was hauling water in a truck and buying hay at ruinous prices trucked up from the valley, and still his cattle bawled along the fences with their hip bones showing. And on the healed ground toward Daddle, the widow's swales still held feed. Not lush, not in a drought like that, but standing cured grass with roots deep in soil that had learned to hold its water, fed by a spring that had not quit, and a hand-dug tank that still had water in the bottom. Ruth's churro sheep, bred for exactly that hard country, browsed steady and came through in decent flesh while the fine cattle of rich men starved a few miles away. That was when they came to look. Let me tell you about that, because it is a quiet thing, and a large one. They came in ones and twos, men who had laughed in that auction barn, riding out her wagon road on some thin excuse, to see with their own eyes the green ground they could not believe in. And they got down off their horses at her fence, and they looked at the standing grass in a killing drought, and they looked at the little lines of rock marching up every draw, and they took off their hats. Not one of them had a word to say. The men who had laughed loudest stood the quietest. There is no silence in the world quite like the silence of a proud man who has just understood he was wrong about something that mattered. And then one hot afternoon, a big new truck came up that road, slower than the rest, and Warren Tice himself climbed down at Ruth Ellender's gate. The biggest cattleman in that end of the county stood there turning his silver-banded hat in his 2 hands like a boy at a schoolhouse door, looking at the widow he had called a fool in front of the whole barn, on the very ground he had refused to take as a gift. He cleared his throat, and Warren Tice asked the widow woman if she would sell him some water, and if she would, God help him, tell him how in the world she had done it. Now what Ruth Ellender said to Warren Tice at that gate, and what she chose to do with the town that had laughed her out of the barn, is the whole point of this story, and it is worth telling right. Drought is not a stranger to New Mexico. It is a regular visitor. The Southwest moves through long cycles of wet and dry years, and the fierce droughts of the 1950s and early 60s broke many ranchers who had stocked their range for the good years and had nothing left when the rain quit. Land grazed hard in the wet years has no reserve when the dry years come. Land that is rested, with deep-rooted native grass and soil that holds moisture, carries far more feed through a drought. The difference is not luck, it is preparation. Ruth Ellender looked at Warren Tice standing at her gate with his hat in his hands, and here is what she did. She did not gloat. She did not send him off with the sharp word he had earned in that auction barn, though a smaller soul surely would have, and no one on that plane would have blamed her for it. She swung the gate open and told him to bring his thirst up to the house, and she filled Marlin's dented tin cup at the spring and handed it to him to drink. And while he drank, she told him plainly how it was done. The rock dams, the rested range, the seep dug clear of 40 years of silt, the patience. She did not keep the knowledge back to punish him. She gave it away. And that is the thing that turned the whole town around, more than the green grass ever did. It is one thing to be proven wrong by a person. Any proud man can nurse a grudge against that and go on despising you in his heart. It is another thing entirely to be proven wrong by a person and then handed a cup of cold water and the very secret that beat you, freely, with no price on it. Warren Tice went back to Magdalena a changed man, and he did not sit quiet about it. He told them at the feed store, in front of all the same men who had laughed, that the widow Ellender had read that land better than any cattleman in the county, himself first of all, and that they had run off 600 acres of good ground, because not one of them had the sense to ask a quiet woman what she knew. Now the years that came after were not a fairy tale, because Ruth's life was never a fairy tale. It was work. But the land paid, the way she always knew it would if a body was patient enough to let it. Her Navajo churro flock grew from 11 head to better than 200, and their long wool, the fine four-horned desert wool, brought good money from weavers who prized it. She planted pinto beans and chicos corn in the moist silt benches behind her biggest dams, dry farming the way the old Hispano families had done on that plain for 300 years, and the beans came in year after year. Within 6 seasons, Ruth Ellender had paid off every dollar against that place and owned her 600 acres free and clear. The same ground a rich man would not take as a gift. And the men came to her fence to learn. That is a thing worth sitting with a moment. The same country that had laughed her out of the barn now sent its ranchers and its young men out the Daddle Road to walk her draws and study her little rock dams and ask her, hat in hand, how to bring their own ruined ground back. She never turned one of them away. She would walk them up a healed arroyo and show them the bench of new soil and the grass rooted in it. And she would say the water is not gone. It is only running too fast. And your whole job is to teach it to walk instead of run. Boys who heard her say it carried that ground-healing knowledge onto their own children. And there are draws all across that end of Socorro County that still hold their soil today because of what an old woman gave away for nothing. She lived on that place the rest of her days. She grew truly old there, brown and lean and quiet as ever. And folks who had once pitied her came, in time, to speak her name the way you speak the name of somebody the country is proud of. And near the end of her life, a young man from the county newspaper drove out to write her story. The widow who bought the worthless ranch and made it bloom. And he sat at her kitchen table with his notebook and asked her the question everyone always wanted to ask. How did you know? How did you stand up in that barn with everyone laughing and bet every last dollar you had on ground everyone else called dead? And this is the part I have been waiting to tell you, because Ruth Ellender never once, in all those years, said the lesson out loud. Not to the neighbors, and not to Warren Tice, and not to herself. She said it only that one time to that young man, in her own plain words. And here is what she said. She said, "They were all looking at the dust on top. My Marlin taught me to look at the water underneath. There is a difference between land that is dead and land that is only tired. And there is a difference between a person that is finished and a person that is only grieving. And it is the same difference, son." Everybody in that barn had already decided what that ground was and what I was, and neither one of us was what they thought. Nothing is worthless if you are willing to learn what it needs and patient enough to give it, for as long as it takes. That is the whole of it. That is everything I know. The young man wrote it down, and then, because he was young and wanted a picture for his story, he asked if there was some keepsake, some memento of all those hard years that he might see. Ruth Ellender got up from the table, and she went to the window, and she brought back the one thing she had carried through all of it. It was nothing much to look at. It was an old tin drinking cup, dented deep on one side, the tin worn silver bright at the rim where a man's mouth had rested against it for 30 years. Marlon's cup. The cup she had warmed her hands on in the freezing dugout. The cup she had filled at the seep on the morning the water first came back, and knelt in the dust and told a dead man he was right. She set it on the sill in the last of the evening light. It stood there, small and plain, and dented, holding a swallow of clear cold water drawn from a spring that a whole town had sworn was dry. And the low sun came through the window and lit the water in the old cup until it shone like something worth far more than the $310 everybody had laughed at all those years ago. In a cold barn on the edge of Magdalena, New Mexico. The widow said nothing more. She did not need to. Some things carry their whole meaning without a word laid over them, and a cup of clear water from ground that everyone called dead is one of them. Two of the things that carried Ruth through belong to that country still. The Navajo churro is an old, hardy sheep brought to the Southwest centuries ago, prized for tough constitution and long, fine wool that hand weavers value to this day. It thrives on sparse desert browse that would fail improved breeds. And dry land pinto beans and chicos, planted in moist-bottom soil and grown without irrigation, have fed families on the New Mexico plains for generations. Old knowledge, patiently kept, outlasts the laughter of any single hard season.